Imagine you are a young German Jew born in the 1920s. After the Nazis came to power, you had to flee your home, leave your family behind, and start a new life in America. Last thing you heard, your family had been deported and sent to a ghetto. You don't know whether they're alive or dead. You're desperate to fight back, and the U.S. Army gives you the opportunity. Because you speak several languages, they make you an intelligence man. You fight through Normandy, the Ardennes, and into Germany. There, you witness the true scale of the murder of your people. Finally, at long last, you will know your family's fate. I'm Spartacus Olsson, and this is episode 131 of The War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. That story just now is the true story of Guy Stern, born Günther Stern in Hildesheim in 1922. He was 11 when Hitler came to power in 1933. In the face of Nazi persecution, Guy's parents decided that the family had to leave the country in 1937. They managed to borrow enough money to send Guy to relatives in St. Louis. That was his salvation. But the rest of the family couldn't get enough cash together, so Guy's parents, sister, and brother were left behind in Germany. The last thing Guy heard was that they had all been deported to the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. Meanwhile, Guy volunteered for U.S. Navy intelligence. He speaks German and knows the country well, so he reckoned he could do his bit for the war. But the Navy rejected him because he hadn't been born in the States. Fortunately, the Navy's loss turned out to be the Army's gain. They draft Guy in 1943 and send him off to become a Richie boy. And what is a Richie boy? Well, the name comes from the training center at Camp Richie in Maryland, where the men trained to fight the intelligence war, hence the Richie boys. About 20,000 men passed through Camp Richie through the war. The Army prizes language skills and cultural knowledge, so it's hardly surprising that the Richie boys have very varied backgrounds. 44% of them are born outside of the U.S. Languages spoken around the camp include German, Italian, Russian, Greek, Norwegian, Polish, and Arabic. Above all, the Army wants men of German background. 19% of the Richie boys were born there. The camp's Latin motto is "Fas est et ab hoste docere," which means you must learn from the enemy. Indeed, parts of the camp will look quite familiar to the German-born students. Inside there's a replica German village square, complete with a town hall, post office, and beer garden. Here the troops train in street fighting techniques, raiding buildings and detecting booby traps. Students also hone their skills by interrogating German-speaking soldiers and sometimes even real German POWs. They also watch German newsreels to expose them to Nazi propaganda techniques. Like Guy, about 2,000 of the German speakers at Camp Richie are Jewish refugees who fled Nazi persecution. These men are determined to take the fight to Hitler and find out what has happened to their families. As Guy will later say, "We were fighting an American war, and we were also fighting an intensely personal war. We were in it with every fiber of our being. We worked harder than anyone could have driven us. We were crusaders." The Richie boys have to wait a while for their crusade to begin, but when D-Day comes, they finally return to Europe. On D-Day, Guy Stern goes ashore at Omaha Beach and quickly begins interrogating German prisoners, questioning local civilians, and translating for the U.S. Army. He soon proves his worth when a group of forced laborers provides a detailed plan for German defenses on the Chalon Island. But things are a bit less successful for fellow Richie boy Werner Angris, at least to begin with. Angris' story is similar to Guy's. He was born in Berlin, and his German-Jewish family fled to Amsterdam in 1937. Werner left for the U.S. in 1939, but the rest of his family remained behind and were deported during the German occupation of Holland. On June 6th, he jumps into battle with the 82nd Airborne, but just 9 days later he's taken prisoner by the Germans. He hides his Jewish identity, gets a job in the camp as an orderly, and uses his German and French language skills to collect information from his captors. He's freed on June 27th by the US troops. After the Battle of Normandy, Richie boys follow the Allied armies across Europe, and soon the war starts to get very personal. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 is particularly special for Victor Brombert, who was born in Berlin to a Jewish family of Russian origin. In the 1930s, he and his family fled Nazi persecution for Paris, only to find themselves under Hitler's thumb once again in 1940. In 1941, they fled south to the unoccupied zone, made their way to Spain, and from Spain to the United States, where Brombert was drafted into the U.S. Army. Speaking French, German, and Russian, he was an ideal candidate for the Richie boys. Brombert lands with the 2nd Armored Division at Omaha Beach and fights through the Battle of Normandy and Operation Cobra. When the division reaches the Seine, they are ordered to hold back and allow the French troops to enter Paris first. Brombert is having none of that, though. He hasn't come all this way just to wait around. On August 25th, he defies orders, hops into his Jeep, and drives off to Paris. His first stop is his former home, the 16th arrondissement, which had been home to a large community of anti-Bolshevik Russians. He passes through settings of his childhood, his school, his aunt's house, streets where he played. He's glad to see that Paris has been spared the destruction of some of the Norman towns wrecked by Allied bombing, like Saint-Lô. But Victor's mood quickly turns to sadness when he visits the home of his former girlfriend. There, he gets confirmation that she was deported back in 1942. After the war, he will learn that she, along with his aunt, were murdered at Auschwitz. Fighting his emotions, he climbs back behind the wheel, speeds off again, and finds solace in the joyous celebrations in the Jardin du Luxembourg. He loses himself in the cheering crowds, the champagne, and the women. The celebrations in Paris are a brief respite for Victor. But before long, it's back into the firing line as the Richie boys are thrown into the Battle of the Bulge. For two of them, this battle will have tragic endings. These two men are Berlin-born Jews named Kurt Jacobs and Murray Sapler. They are attached to the 106th Infantry Division and are stationed at Bleilf. On the first day of the German offensive, December 16th, their unit takes about 30 prisoners. Murray and Jacobs begin interrogating them in a requisitioned house. Just 4 days later, on the 20th, the American position is overrun by German Volksgrenadiers led by Hauptmann Kurt Bruns. Some 300 Americans, including Jacobs and Sapler, are taken prisoner and marched into the local customs house. After this, two of the newly freed German prisoners report to Bruns that they had been interrogated by two German-speaking Americans. Bruns immediately extracts Jacobs and Sapler from the customs house. The two men are held up against the wall and Bruns begins questioning them. When he finds out that they are Jewish, Bruns declares, "Juden haben kein Recht in Deutschland zu leben." The Jews have no right to live in Germany. With that, their fate is sealed. Bruns orders Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann to deal with the Richie boys. Hoffmann gets a handful of men together, marches Jacobs and Sapler down the road, and executes them. Their bodies are left lying in the mud. The murder of Jacobs and Sapler is another individual tragedy in the wider system of Nazi mass murder. In early 1945, the Richie boys come face to face with this system. One of the first men to do so is Stefan Levy, who is assigned to the 6th Armored Division. On April 12th, he arrives at newly liberated Buchenwald concentration camp to act as a translator. This isn't the first time Nazi concentration camps have darkened the young man's life. Before he and his family managed to escape Germany, his own father had been imprisoned in Berlin's Oranienburg camp in 1933. Stefan's father was released 2 years later, gaunt, with teeth missing and having suffered a heart attack. Still, even that experience cannot prepare Stefan for what he witnesses. As I have covered in my previous episode, by this point in the war, camps like Buchenwald are filled with prisoners transferred from elsewhere across Germany and occupied Europe. As Stefan walks through the camp, he finds barracks filled beyond bursting, some with 2,000 inmates lying 4 or 5 to a single bed. Outside, the dead and dying are piled high. The GIs are desperately trying to sort out food, water, and medical help. There's also the grim task of burying the dead. Stefan goes to the nearby town of Weimar and informs the mayor that the U.S. Army will need 100 men to come immediately. Another 100 will need to come the next day and the day after that until the work is done. The mayor begins objecting, but Stefan cuts him off. 100 jeden Tag, he says. 100 every day. Stefan supervises the men until their work is finished. Most of them try to deny any knowledge of the camp and its crimes, but Stefan has no time for this. How could they not notice the stench of death and the smoke rising from the towering chimney of the crematorium? How could they possibly have had no idea? While so many German civilians shirk any responsibility, justice comes quickly for at least one Nazi war criminal, Kurt Bruns. The German captain who shot 2 Jewish Richie boys back in December, is captured on February 7th, not far from where he committed his crime. By that point, the U.S. Army is already aware of his actions thanks to one of the men in Bruns' unit, a corporal named Heinrich Kauta. Kauta is a communist who only ended up on the front line after being conscripted from a concentration camp. Back in January, he was captured by the Americans, reported the shooting, gave the rough location of the bodies, and identified Bruns as the officer responsible. Bruns goes on trial on April 7th at Luren. He denies responsibility and blames the killings on his superior officer. But there is plenty of evidence against him. First, there's Kauter's testimony. Second, there's the testimony of Anton Kohn, a German POW working as an informant for the Americans. The Americans assign him as Bruns' cellmate, and he manages to get the officer to admit to the killing. There's also the testimony of a local woman who spoke to Bruns' adjutant shortly after the killings. He told her that 2 Jews had been shot. The judge is convinced by all this evidence and sentences Bruns to death. The sentence is reviewed on April 20th and upheld. The reviewing officer concludes, all war crimes may be punished with death. In a case of this character involving deliberate and unlawful murder, such a sentence is appropriate. Bruns will be shot on June 15th, 1945, becoming the first German Axis criminal to be executed by the U.S. military. While he waits execution, even more Richie boys make their own depressing tours through the Nazi camps in the dying days of the war in Europe. In the first week of May, just days before the German surrender, Richie boys Manny Steinfeld and Werner Angres arrive at Wöbelin concentration camp. When they come to the entrance of the camp, Manny is paralyzed by fear and unable to step through the gates, as he will later say. We had heard rumors about the existence of camps. I didn't know exactly what to expect. I was afraid I might find my mother or sister among the dead. The sad truth of the matter is that Manny is unlikely to find his relatives in a place like Wöbelin. Yes, there are Jews among the prisoners in newly liberated Buchenwald and Wöbelin, but they are the exception to the rule. The vast majority of Jews dragged into the Nazi camp system were murdered in extermination camps like Belzec, Treblinka, or Birkenau. Only towards the end of the war were a relatively small proportion of Jewish prisoners retained in concentration camps for labor. The Richie boys helped to organize a public funeral for the victims of the camps, which takes place at nearby Ludwigslust. The residents of the town are ordered to dig 200 graves, and the entire adult population is made to attend the service. During the service, several German army officers turn their back and light up cigarettes. When Werner demands that they drop cigarettes and face the front, one captain responds that a sergeant like Werner has no right to give orders to officers. Werner has no time for this. He draws his Colt 1911 and points it at the officer's head. You have a choice. Either I shoot you for disobeying my order, or you extinguish your cigarette and face the funeral. That does the trick. But none of the locals want to accept any kind of blame or admit to knowing of the horrors of the camp that was just 3 miles from their town. When Manny speaks to them, the common refrain is, Ich bin kein Nazi. I am not a Nazi. This sounds quite ridiculous to Manny. The Germany that he escaped as a 14-year-old refugee was full of flag-waving Nazis. Where did they all go? Stefan Levy is one of the men charged with finding out. He ends up stationed in Aschaffenburg and is charged with denazifying the city. This is a big job. Aschaffenburg has 30,000 residents, and the Nazis had low-level officials charged with supervising individual blocks of flats and groups of houses. Stefan arms himself with a list of Nazis requisitioned from the police station and sets to work. Supported by a team of military police, he brings dozens of Nazis into custody every day. After a while, he only has to knock at a door and the man of the house appears, hat and coat on, suitcase ready packed. A kiss goodbye to the wife, and he's loaded into Stefan's truck. Now, the majority of these people are interviewed, processed, and released. The Allies pretty quickly realized that if all the former Nazis are locked away, there will be no one to keep the place running. Still, Stefan takes some satisfaction. The Nazis had terrified his family, forced them from their home, and split them apart for years. However long the men stay locked up, Stefan has given them a small taste of their own medicine. Stefan's family are safe and well in the United States, but other Richie boys now face the agonizing task of investigating the fate of their families. In the weeks and months following the German surrender, they travel across the former Reich, searching for answers. Guy Stern returns to his hometown of Hildesheim, now in the British occupation zone. There, a family friend tells him that his family were probably murdered either in the Warsaw Ghetto or in a Nazi extermination camp. Manny Steinfeld returns to Josbach, searching for his mother and sister. When he arrives, he finds that all 6 Jewish families were deported in late 1941. His former neighbors can tell him nothing more than this. It takes many years for him to learn the full story, that his mother and sister were deported to the Riga Ghetto and gassed at Stutthof concentration camp in June 1944. Werner Angres drives his Jeep up to Amsterdam. There, he learns that his father was deported to Auschwitz in 1943. It isn't until the 1990s that Werner receives final confirmation that his father was murdered there. But for now, he's reunited with his mother and brothers. They have survived in hiding thanks to the Dutch resistance. With the war over, some of the Jewish Richie boys waste no time in heading back to the United States, but others stay on in Europe and serve as interrogators or translators during the Nuremberg trials, helping to bring to justice the men who murdered so many of their people. Never forget.